Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for today's program. Today we're going to be talking about John Macarthur, and we're going to be talking about an article that appeared on the Royce Report. This is a website that is produced by Julie Royce, who is an investigative journalist, a Christian, evangelical Christian. She appeared many years on Moody Radio, had a program, and she now has a podcast where she interviews people, and she does a lot of poking around in the Christian world. She tries to hold evangelical pastors accountable, especially the bigger ones, the large megachurch pastors. She is known for going after megachurch pastors. She's done this in the case of, for example, at Willow Creek Community Church. She reported all about Pastor Bill Hybels, Pastor McDonald at the Harvest Chapel, also out there in Illinois, and some of the scandals involving high-profile megachurch pastors. So she is known for someone who digs around a lot, and you might say a troublemaker. She's known for being a troublemaker, but in the sense that she's wanting to try to hold these pastors accountable for their lifestyles and their decisions and their behaviors, because hold them to the convictions and the beliefs and the behaviors that they teach. In other words, make them practice what they preach. So in one sense, it's a great service for what Julie Royce is doing, and that is she is digging up dirt and digging up problems, maybe inconsistencies, maybe hypocrisies among some of the largest megachurch pastors in our country. And in a sense, that is a service to the Christian church. In a sense, that is a service to the body of Christ, because after all, we're all called to be accountable as Christians. We are all called to practice what we preach, especially the preachers. I mean, we're all, as pastors and as church leaders, called to live not only to the basic Christian lifestyle standards, but also to higher standards. That's what leadership is. It's calling men in the church to a higher standard so that they might be role models for other Christians to emulate. And so Julie Royce, as much as there are those who do not like what she's doing, and I believe right now Grace Community Church and its leadership team probably doesn't like what Julie Royce is doing, but as we'll see as we get into the conversation, she raises a lot of good questions. She doesn't necessarily frame them in the most charitable or even the most fair way, honest way. She does tend to frame them in a worst possible light, and doesn't try to explore how these accusations might actually be acceptable. And as far as John Macarthur, we're going to get into his situation. Julie Royce has done a number of investigations on John Macarthur, the large megachurch pastor who has a huge influence on the radio and television and on the internet. He's written some 80 books, and he is the president of a college and seminary out there in, I believe it's North Los Angeles. What is that? Van Nuys, California, up around that area. I've been there. I've actually been to John Macarthur's church on one Sunday. He was not there. He was not preaching on the Sunday I attended, but it is a large campus, not overly large as far as the church building itself. There are plenty and plenty of churches all over the country that are bigger as far as attendance-wise and as far as the size of the church building. But he also holds a service, holds a seminary there, and then also a college there. So a lot of responsibilities on him. He is the president of the college and the seminary. He is also the president of Grace to You, the radio and media arm of the ministry of John Macarthur. Maybe he's not the president of it, but I think that might be Phil Johnson. But he is an officer on the board. And he is also, of course, the senior pastor of Grace Community Church, the large megachurch there. I think it's 8,000, 10,000 members. So the issue, though, that Julie Royce brings up, and I believe the question is legitimate, she raises the question, here is John Macarthur, who preaches and is highly critical of some of the more prosperity preachers that are out there on television and radio. You're talking about Creflo Dollar, Joel Osteen, and on and on and on. There are just hundreds and hundreds of the so-called prosperity preachers who actually say that it's God's will for you to be rich. They don't always say it as directly as that, but they may hint that it's God's will for you to be rich, and that there's nothing wrong, and there's nothing wrong with being super rich, and that it's just a matter of faith. And if you had the faith, you could also be very wealthy and have riches also. And so the whole prosperity theology, and we won't get into that today, but John Macarthur has been against this whole idea for many, many decades now, and he preaches against it, and he actually names the names. He talks about occasionally Joel Osteen. He talks about some of the other high-profile prosperity preachers. So he's not at all shy of criticizing the prosperity message. And in fact, recently he just gave a sermon where he says basically, if they're preaching a prosperity message, they're probably in ministry mostly for the money. Now, Julie Royce raises a question. Well, what about John Macarthur himself? He is not a prosperity preacher. He does not claim that God wants everyone to be rich. Yet, his ministry, his Grace Community Church, the seminary that he's president of, and the Grace to You ministry media arm have brought in riches to John Macarthur. And she lays out the evidence in her report, basically saying, well, first of all, John Macarthur makes six figures from his teaching and preaching at Grace Community Church. So being the senior pastor of Grace Community Church, John Macarthur makes a six-figure salary. It's maybe $300,000, $400,000 a year just from his teaching and preaching at the church and his leadership there. Then he's also getting a salary from the Master's Seminary as being the president there, and that's a few extra $100,000. And then he's also given a salary for being on the executive team of Grace to You Media Ministry, which probably then also brings in hundreds of thousands of dollars, not even counting the royalties of his 80-some books that are out in print, some of them massively best-selling books, and his speaking invitations and conferences and all of the other things he's involved in. So he has a revenue stream that probably brings in well over $1 million a year, typically annually. So he is a millionaire. John Macarthur, he, as much as he preaches against prosperity preaching and theology and criticizes prosperity preachers specifically by name, he is a millionaire. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with what he's doing, but it does put things in perspective. Here is a millionaire criticizing other millionaires in their ministry. Now, she also brings out the point that John Macarthur owns 3 homes. He has been living in the home that he bought for decades near the church, and that is over, I think it's $1.5 million valuation on that home. There's a large built-in swimming pool and a tennis court. Great, fine. That's something that a lot of people have in California especially, and that's one of the factors we'll also be talking about. He lives in California, which is one of the most expensive places to live in certain areas. For example, if he were up in Silicon Valley, where some of the big tech companies are, just to get into a small, you might say starter home would cost over $1 million. So you'd almost have to be making the big bucks in Silicon Valley just to buy a home, period. And then if you wanted a home of any size beyond a starter home, you'd probably have to shell out a couple million or so. And it's that way in certain areas of Los Angeles. There are certain sections of Los Angeles. There are certain areas down San Diego. There are all kinds of pockets where the cost of living is extremely high. And generally speaking, California is a very difficult place to afford to live. That's why so many people are moving out these days. But the gasoline prices are always some of the highest in the country. And the cost of living in California, because of the high taxations and other things, are just outrageous. So a lot of people are moving out for that very reason. But John Macarthur does own a $1.5 million home in the area where the church is at. Then he also owns a home in another part of California that is probably close to $1 million, if not over. And then he owns property and a nice big home in Colorado Springs, which for his third home, and that probably is also evaluated probably close to $1 million. So he owns quite a few properties, and they're not just little homes. They're quite nice homes. So he's definitely not someone who is, you might say, stingy or frugal with his money. He's definitely someone who is not afraid to spend his own money, which that's his right. Now, the question is it appropriate for a pastor to be a millionaire? And when you look at John Macarthur, he's not just a millionaire. He is, by all indications, he's a multi-millionaire. He's a millionaire many times over. He's not just someone who has a net worth of $1 million, or who actually has $1 million in assets, liquid assets right now. So he's not just someone like that, because there are a lot of people in every state. It's not just California, but in California especially, because of the cost of living and everything is scaled up there. Salaries are jacked up and taxes are jacked up and cost of living is jacked up. Because of that, in California, there are probably thousands of millionaires, maybe tens of thousands of millionaires. I'm not sure. But $1 million today in the 21st century is not that big of a deal. It used to be a huge deal. I remember you would see these old-time movies, and you'd have these business tycoons dreaming of the day that they would be a millionaire. You know, being a millionaire was a big milestone. And now today, the old millionaire status is now considered billionaire status. So it's not enough just to be a millionaire, because there's so many of them around. The tech areas, for example, up in Silicon Valley, some of the basic workers that started at Microsoft and some of these other high-tech companies, they all are millionaires because their stock went up when the company prospered. And lo and behold, here you have people sitting around doing programming and coding, and they're paid at first, because the company hasn't made it yet, they're paid in stocks and different other assets. And all of a sudden the company goes public and their stock prices rise, and all of a sudden here you have these regular workers, and now they're millionaires. And some of them multi-millionaires many times over, hundreds of millions of dollars. Of course, in the higher executive people are billionaires in many instances. So money is flying all over the place in these tech areas and in California in general. But we've seen that all over the country. The cost of living, the wages have skyrocketed in many areas. So $1 million is not the way it used to be. So for a pastor, for it to be known that a pastor is worth $1 million is no big deal. But the question is is it appropriate for a pastor of a church, a pastor of a Christian church, to allow even the success of the church and the success of his ministry? Is it appropriate for him to allow his financial assets to grow and grow and grow just unlimitedly? Is that appropriate? I know that some megachurch pastors, like for example Rick Warren, have decided, well, hey, no, it isn't appropriate for a pastor to be making uh, a lot of wealth from ministry, and so he's going to start a foundation, and he's going to put the royalties of his million-selling books and other income revenue streams, he's going to pour those into this foundation, and then he's going to use the money in the foundation for humanitarian efforts. And Rick Warren does a lot of um, aid and development in third world countries, water development, and all kinds of humanitarian projects, as well as evangelism projects, and so on and so forth. So his solution, Rick Warren's solution, another megachurch millionaire, is to use a foundation and just pour the money that comes from royalties and any other wealth streams into that, instead of actually bringing it into his own personal portfolio, you might say. And that is probably also what John Macarthur does to some extent. But is it appropriate for megachurch pastors to live like the rich and famous? Now, when you look at John Macarthur and you look at his lifestyle, it doesn't strike you as something that is opulent. It doesn't strike you as something that is gaudy or is a conspicuous show of consumption. The phrase used to be by The Economist that some people would show off their wealth and be conspicuous in their consumption, be lavish in their lifestyle. It doesn't seem to me that John Macarthur drives around in the fanciest cars or lives in the fanciest home or is part of the jet set and tries to live the high life. It doesn't seem to be that way. So the Bible does warn against the love of money is the root of all evil, but John Macarthur doesn't seem to be falling into the temptation of loving money. But that still brings up the question, should pastors of churches, Christian pastors, those who are following in the footsteps of the disciples and who are in Christian ministry, should they be permitted or should they permit themselves to get rich, period? Is $1 million, is $1 million pastor an appropriate thing to have in any size church? Now, a lot of the pastors, for example, in the megachurch movement, they'll say, well, if you look at the size of the organization that I'm leading and you look at a comparable business, the executives in this business would be making $700,000 a year. And so my $700,000 a year salary, for example, wouldn't be over and above what the means of an organization like mine is. Well, the problem is you're not a business in the corporate world. You are a Christian church. And Christian ministers must not have the love of money. Now, I'm not saying John Macarthur has the love of money, but I'm saying that one might get the impression that while he didn't love money, he didn't have any problem with spending the money that comes in to him in abundance. If you have 3 homes, that means that you're not adverse to spending a lot of money. If you buy $1 million home, you have just purchased something for $1 million. And so that what that means is you have no problem spending $1 million, and you have no problem getting $1 million, and you have no problem spending $1 million. And we all know from the scripture that money is a very tempting thing. And Jesus actually warned. He says, hard it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He says, easier for a man to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. That's a warning. That's a warning about the consequences of trying to get rich and trying to acquire possessions and the dangers of money, the idolatry that can come from money. Well, so Julie Royce is, I believe, correct in making this known to the public. She's trying to put a perspective and a context to the ministry of John Macarthur and say, now look, yeah, what he's saying about the prosperity ministry is 100% correct in that theology has problems. But you also understand you're talking about a millionaire pastor. So he himself, and while he's talking about the problems with the prosperity preachers, primarily their theology, you have to realize that he is sitting in a seat of luxury and he prospers. Now, the other counter argument could very well be posed to Julie Royce. Well, what is the motivation for John Macarthur's owning 3 homes? We don't understand the context. We don't know the details. I think you have to look at the circumstances and say, okay, what are his justifications? The question is, does John Macarthur owe anyone justification for any of his financial spending? On one level, each person in this country, we pretty much, there's an unspoken rule that you don't pry too deeply into the spending and the salary of others that you may know, whether family members, friends, acquaintances. That's kind of personal information. So in one sense, we don't have a right to actually require of John Macarthur that he explain why he bought 3 homes and why he is a millionaire many times over, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, as a minister of the gospel and as a preacher and as an heir to the apostles, he's standing in the seat of the apostles and he's preaching the word of God, and he's preaching about the corrupting nature of money, and he's preaching about the dangers of money, and he's preaching about idolatry, and all of these things are found in the Bible that he is correctly preaching about. We have the right to ask him, are you walking the walk and following what you're preaching? Are you practicing what you're preaching? Is there a limit to how much a pastor should take in as far as money, even if his ministry prospers? Or is it just open-ended? If the ministry keeps prospering and the church prospers and the radio media ministry prospers and the conference speaking and speaking fees prosper, do you just keep it coming in and becoming more prosperous? Or is there a limit for a pastor where he says, wait, time out. This is not something that I want to expand. This is not something that I want to grow in. I don't want to grow in my wealth. I am content. I have, what does Paul say? If we have enough to eat and drink, we are content. He's learned to be content in all situations. Does he have a code or standard or rules that govern his wealth building and purchasing and his expenditures? And does he have a philosophy of his own personal money? And I think that the church does he owes the church a teaching, an explanation, a discussion about how he has grappled with this and what are the consequences of being a millionaire pastor. And is that something that communicates the simplicity and the humbleness and the holiness of the Christian ministry? Or does it communicate something else? Does it communicate sort of a hypocrisy, a double standard? You know, the Pharisees of Jesus' time, it says that they loved money, and they were all always looking for money. Well, I'm not saying that John Macarthur does that. I don't believe he does look toward money and try to figure out ways to make money. And I don't think he has that sort of business entrepreneurial spirit in him, that he's always looking at some angle how he can bring in more money. But while that may not be the case, there's no question that John Macarthur has allowed the money to roll in. He has permitted the church to give him a high six-figure salary. He has allowed the church and the ministries and the boards to make him $1 million. And he hasn't stopped it. He hasn't said, no, wait. I have a home. I have a comfortable salary. I have a car. My needs are met. I don't want to expand my wealth. I'm not into wealth creation. That's not my thing. I'm a minister of the gospel, and I don't want to get distracted by that. I don't want anyone else to be distracted by that. I don't want that to be a stumbling block. I don't want that to be a scandal. That's what the word scandal means, stumbling block. I want to put the brakes on and say, whoa, here's my limit. I'm happy. I'm content. My needs are met. Boom. That's it. That's all I care about. It would be interesting to see what Pastor John Macarthur, what his thoughts are on this whole issue that Julie Royce raises. Instead, I see John Macarthur's longtime friend and business associate, Phil Johnson, defending him and trying to beat back these questions. Instead of doing that, I think it would be a good teachable moment for him to sit down with John Macarthur and say, look, there are questions that this investigative reporter have raised. Please, let's just have a good conversation about this whole topic. Is it ever legitimate for pastors to be millionaires? Is it ever legitimate for pastors to be multi-millionaires? Millionaires many times over. Is it appropriate for pastors to own 2, 3, 4, 5 homes? Is it appropriate for pastors to have that level of wealth? Or is there something inherently wrong with the whole idea of a minister being rich, while there are people in his congregation who are struggling financially and are putting their pennies in the plate and barely able to make it? What are your thoughts? It would be nice for Phil Johnson to not be defensive, to not always just kind of like go in and fight for his pastor, John Macarthur, but actually let's sit down and talk about this and open ourselves up to the public and be transparent, and maybe others can help us and we can learn from the whole thing. So, well, anyway, that is a start of a conversation on a very important topic. We'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.